Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moblin coming at you with another APGov video. This is our second video focusing in on topic 4.8, ideology and policymaking. Now last time we were focusing in on how, there are different influences on the policymaking process. It could be a focus on, deciding, what is best, what do the majority of the people want versus, what do certain special interests want. But regardless of who's influencing the policy, there is basically a formula. There's basically a format by which policy is generated in our government. Now, if you take a look at the policy formation process, the first thing is to decide, okay, what is on the policy agenda? In other words, what is important? Should our priority be climate change? Should it be, deregulation of business? Should it be providing a more interventionist foreign policy? Should it be education? Should it be, research in science? Whatever that is, you got to decide, what is on the agenda. And if it's not, of importance or particular importance, then it doesn't get put on the agenda. Therefore, it does not become policy. So, if you are someone that is wanting certain policies in a certain area, you need to get the attention of government to make it onto the agenda. Now, granted, that can be done through the work of lobbying and, things like that, but it's got to get on the government's agenda list, otherwise it's not going to be addressed. Now, when considering policy, legislators are always thinking of the cost-benefit analysis. Now that kind of comes in a couple of different forms. There's the cost benefit analysis in terms of, all right, we could get this positive effect, but will negative side effects outweigh the positive gains that we may make if this policy is implemented? Okay. Now granted, let's be honest, there's also political analyses dealing with cost benefit as well. A politician might go, okay, well, this might be best for the country overall, but will this result in my constituents voting me out because my particular constituents may not agree with this kind of policy? So there's different kinds of cost-benefit analyses that are considered when policy is, being looked at. Now, that being said, let's assume that a certain area of policy is put on the agenda. And let's just say, for example, that, it is education. Let's say, for example, it's about, improving the quality of education in our public schools. Well, if a law is, introduced, we've mentioned before, we've talked about the legislative process, you have to keep in mind that, when a certain policy, be it, let's say, for example, it's a bill that would, for example, increase standardized testing for students, and have it impact, what teachers would be making, for example, that you would be attaching salaries to teachers based on student performance on assessments. That would first be heard in hearings in committee, and as we said before, during these hearings, experts are brought in to testify to explain, why this policy might be good, why it might be bad. A lot of these folks are tied to intergroups, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the language that is put into the legislation, the policy itself, is going to be very critical. Will there be exceptions for example, students that are recent immigrants to the United States? Will those scores be counted? Will scores be as heavily weighed in on a teacher's salary if they're a rookie teacher versus a veteran teacher? So all these kind of things that get into the nooks and crannies of the legislation obviously are going to be affecting what the policy is going to be doing. Now, once that legislation has been, amended, in other words, the policy's language has been crafted to a point where it's now going to be looking at, the full chamber. Now it's about getting it adopted. It's about getting it passed into law and going through those processes politically to get it done. You're talking about, the use of whips, counting votes, trying, for example, a president might be in support of the bill that we're looking at, and the president might use the bully pulpit as a way to kind of, put popular pressure on members of Congress to get it passed. So understand that, the policy adoption phase is really just the idea of, getting a bill passed into law. Now, once that bill is passed into law, then we get into what's called the policy implementation phase. And basically, Congress gives birth to a bill, but then it is basically raised, if you will, by the executive branch. That, if you're talking about a bill that is going to be tying student test performance to teacher salaries, then that would be sent to the appropriate agency or department. In this case, let's just say the Department of Education. Now, once the Department of Education gets that bill, then it's their responsibility to properly put that law into effect, or in other words, put that policy into effect. Sometimes a certain policy is created that you may have to create new departments to be able to, basically make it work. So if, for example, if you are, creating a lot of policy dealing with, things dealing with power plants, for example, you might have to create, the Department of Energy to be able to make that happen. So sometimes the policy will be sent into a pre-existing executive branch agency, or sometimes it's going to be, creating a new part of the bureaucracy as well. And note, keep in mind, the more, policy, the more policy that a particular agency or bureau or department is responsible for, the more power it's going to have. It's going to have more funding. It's going to have more bureaucrats, all that kind of stuff. So the policy has been crafted. It's been adopted, meaning it's been passed into law, and it's now being implemented. Then the next thing that has to be looked at is whether or not the policy is working. We go through policy evaluation, and we mentioned previously, that this is done by congressional oversight committees. Sometimes there are internal evaluations done, like, for example, if this new, student assessment tied to teacher pay, policy is put into effect within the Department of Education, you might see the Department of Education doing its own internal evaluations to see if this policy is actually working. In other words, after a couple of years, are we seeing, test scores improve as, pay for teachers goes up, or vice versa? Now, if it is working, great. If the policy is not working as intended, then that is going to lead to some, consequences. It might be a matter of, well, it's working. It would work better if it has more funding. It needs more funding to be more successful. Or maybe it's not working the way that we want, but if we just tweak the legislation, tweak the language of the policy, that could make it work. Or it just might be viewed as this is a failed policy. And if it's a failed policy, then it's just going to be eliminated. It's going to be repealed by Congress. Note that a lot of this stuff is going to be done by Congress, but it could also be done within a particular part of the bureaucracy. Remember, when you're implementing policy, a lot of that policy language is left vague, so that you've got these bureaucrats with now basically quasi-legislative power to kind of decide, how this is going to actually be put into motion. Now, note also, policy can be challenged in other ways. For example, you might have a policy that exists in terms of, like say, hey, we're going to give the president the ability to line item veto things. Well, that could then be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So the judiciary can, challenge policy by deeming it unconstitutional and striking it down. Additionally, you're talking about policy that might be made at the state level. That could also be, undone by the will of the people. We mentioned previously that you've got these things called referendums, where the people themselves propose legislation, and then they are able to vote it into effect. Well, you might have government policy that's in place, and the people do not like it, they do not want it, they believe that it is failed policy, and they don't want to wait until there's new elections for new legislators to change the policy. They could then take the initiative, not to confuse it with the actual thing called initiative, but to take the steps to actually organize a referendum bill and then change the policy that way. But remember, if you're talking about referendums, that is only at the state level. There is no such thing as a national referendum. Okay? All right, so that's taking a look at formation of policy. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.